Thank you, Ross. So I'm now going to talk about another protected area of the government budget, and that's how we spend our foreign aid budget. And I should mention this chapter was done in collaboration with the Centre for Global Development. So the context for this is that UK aid spending is at an all-time high. So in 2017, the government spent £14 billion on foreign aid, which is also known as Official Development Assistance, or ODA. And this is an £11 billion increase since 1999. And on current growth forecasts, this is estimated to increase by another £1 billion by 2022. Now, the reason this uplift in spending has been observed is that the government is committed to spending 0.7% of gross national income on foreign aid, and we can see that in the last 5 years, the government has met this target. And in fact, it's met this target very precisely, never deviating by more than 0.005 percentage points from that target. This 0.7% target comes from a UN resolution in 1970, and in 2005, EU 15 countries made commitments to reach this target by 2015. As a result, foreign aid is now 1.7% of government expenditure. This is compared to 0.9% 10 years ago. This level of spending also sets the UK apart internationally. So here we have 2017 aid spending for the UK as a proportion of national income, and you can see us hitting that 0.7% target. If we compare that to the other EU 15 countries who made this commitment to reach the target by 2015, the UK is one of only 4 countries, alongside Sweden, Luxembourg, and Denmark, to meet the target. And amongst the broader group of Development Assistance Committee countries, which is the main international forum for foreign aid, the weighted average is 0.3%, so way below that 0.7% target. And if we look at the change in aid spending for these countries since 2005, we actually see that 10 of those 15 countries that made a commitment to reach this 0.7% target have actually decreased their contributions relative to their gross national income. And only Germany has had a larger relative increase in aid spending than the UK in that time. So given how much we're now spending on aid, it makes it more important than ever to understand how it's being spent. This 0.7% target is actually enshrined in UK law now, which obviously represents a pretty substantial year-on-year fiscal commitment. But as well as changes in the aggregate level of spending, there's also been some changes to the strategy that the UK government has underlying this spending. So in 2015, the Treasury and the Department for International Development, or DFID, published the first cross-government strategy for UK aid. And in this, poverty reduction remains a key objective, but it also stresses supporting security and prosperity abroad and tackling crises. And the UK's national interest is really put at the heart of this strategy as well. Furthermore, in light of Brexit, we're hearing about an increased focus on the role aid might play in the future in creating opportunities for the UK in terms of trade and in terms of investment opportunities. Perhaps the most direct consequence of this 2015 aid strategy is a trend for more departments to be spending aid. So the Department for International Development, or DFID, is the primary department that spends UK aid, and it's got a lot of expertise in this area and performs well in measures of transparency based on aid data. And in line with this total scale-up in aid spending, it does have a much larger budget than it used to, compared to, say, in 2012. However, since 2013, its real terms aid spending has actually declined slightly, with all of the increase in aid spending since then coming through other departments, such as the Foreign Office and the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. So as a result, in 2017, DFID spent 73% of UK aid. This is compared to 88% in 2013. So given that more government departments are now spending UK aid, it makes it more important than ever that the process for allocating aid across government is well designed. So this pie chart shows the 3 broad channels through which UK aid can be channeled. The first one, and the biggest one, is bilateral aid, taking up 45% in 2016, and this is aid that targets a specific country, region, or thematic spending area. Then we have multilateral aid. This is core funding provided to international institutions that carry out development activities. So the UK provides some aid money to institutions like the United Nations, who then go out and carry out some aid projects. And finally, the UK also gives some aid money to these multilaterals, which is earmarked for specific causes. This is known as buy through multi. But for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to bunch together the bilateral and the buy through multi and just refer to those as bilateral together. So in 2016, this umbrella term of bilateral accounted for 64% of UK aid and 62% in 2017. That's about £9 billion. And when we're thinking about where this bilateral aid goes, we could think about the top recipient countries that receive this aid. Now, there's been some changes in recent years, but also significant continuity. The choice of recipient countries for UK aid reflects a pretty broad range of factors, including the poverty rates of those countries, but also the comparative advantage that the UK thinks it has in delivering aid to those countries. So we see countries like Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Pakistan, which was the top receiver of UK aid in 2016, continuing to take large proportions. But yeah, as I said, some changes in relation to this 2015 aid strategy. So there's quite an explicit focus on responding to crises and conflict in that strategy. And as a result, we see a lot more aid going to Syria and its neighbors in recent years. There's also been a shift to development partnerships with some countries. This is a move away from what you might think of as traditional forms of aid and more emphasis on technical assistance and private sector development. So India, which was the top recipient of UK aid in 2012, has seen its total aid reduced by 70% in the last few years. In terms of thematic spending areas, we haven't seen drastic changes in the patterns in those in recent years. So thematic areas such as health, education, and governance programs continue to be really prominent. One noticeable change is a big increase in humanitarian aid, which constituted the largest proportion in 2015 and 16. And this is again linked to the emphasis in the new strategy on crisis response. One noticeable change is a greater role for what DFID calls development capital. And this is defined as public investment made in the private sector to achieve development objectives. And in fact, the Treasury has set a target for DFID to spend £5 billion in this way over the 2015 spending review period. And this is compared to £100 million in the 2013-14 year. The main way that DFID can achieve this spending is through CDC, which is the UK's development finance institution. It provides loans and equity to the private sector in developing countries with the goal of creating jobs and spurring economic activity. And capital injections of £3 billion over 6 years from 2017 have been announced for CDC. And in fact, just last week, the International Development Secretary made a speech which suggested an even greater role for CDC in UK aid going forward. And the interesting thing about this type of aid is that it doesn't add to the headline measure of the deficit, in essence because DFID obtains an asset as well. So while there might be really good reasons to spend aid in this way, particularly if there are capital market imperfections in these countries, it's important that these kind of secondary objectives aren't driving the choice of aid projects. Turning now to the other part of the pie, which is multilateral aid, as I said, funding international development institutions. This accounted for 36% of UK aid in 2016, that's £5 billion. And that actually makes the UK the largest funder of these multilateral aid institutions in the world in absolute terms. And over 60% of the UK's aid of this type went to the development activities of the EU, IMF, and World Bank. And unfortunately, we can't even escape Brexit in the aid presentation because the EU is actually the UK's biggest multilateral partner. It received £1.5 billion in aid funding from the UK in 2016. 0.9 billion of this came through the UK's contributions to the Commission's budget. And continuing a common theme, there's a great deal of uncertainty about future arrangements in this regard. The UK has signalled that it wishes to continue having a very close relationship with the EU on aid, but has made this subject to 2 red lines. Firstly, influence over how funds are used and influence over how funds are used and the strategy overseeing these funds. And secondly, equal access for UK organisations bidding for EU aid projects. An interesting thing to note about this subplot is that the 0.7 commitment that the UK has to aid means that any money that comes back from its aid contributions to the EU will be earmarked for aid spending in some other form in the future. So to sum up quickly, The UK's commitment to aid spending entails a pretty significant fiscal commitment, forecast at over £14 billion for 2018. And while it's too early to draw very strong conclusions, because we're only working with a year or two of data at the moment, an updated aid strategy does seem to be affecting how UK aid is spent, most notably with more departments being responsible for that aid spending, but also with more humanitarian aid and greater emphasis on private sector investments. Going forward, there's a few areas of pretty considerable uncertainty for the UK aid landscape. So next year we have the spending review, which will determine which departments will be spending aid going forward and the process behind that. It looks like CDC might have a pretty significant role for UK aid in the future, but exactly what that will be, we don't know yet. And finally, big question marks about how Brexit is going to affect UK aid. Thank you very much. I will now hand over to Polly.